Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1881. The wind blew dry and hard across the open plains near Medicine Bow, where the land stretched wide and the sky looked close enough to touch. Nella Darnell was 17 when her father forced the branding iron to her wrist. A D carved in flesh, not for cattle but for his own daughter. So no man with sense tries to take you early, he spat, drunken breath thick with bitterness. No one marries a girl marked like stock. She had not cried, not when the hot metal burned her skin or when the scar healed ridged and angry. She had only looked out the cabin window, watching the cottonwoods sway, telling herself she would leave as soon as she was grown. Now, at 18, she stood outside that same cabin, her hands wrapped in a worn apron, watching dust rise from the road. Her father had died last winter, frozen drunk in a snowbank, and she'd been alone since. The neighbors barely looked her way, not after the stories he left behind. "Branded girl," they whispered. "Trouble." The rider came slow, tall in the saddle, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. His horse was lean, dust-colored, and moved like it had been across half the country. Nella stiffened, one hand unconsciously covering her wrist. The cowboy stopped at the fence. "You Nella Darnell," she nodded, wary. He dismounted, boots crunching dry grass. "Name's Hart Galloway. Your uncle sent me from Kansas. Said you might need help running the place come spring." She blinked. "I do not have an uncle," he shrugged. "He said you would say that, but he figured you deserved someone decent looking after you. Paid me a winter's wages to come check." "Why would he do that?" she asked, arms folded tight. "Because he knew what your father did," Hart said simply, eyes meeting hers with quiet steadiness. "And because someone ought to." The wind kicked up again. Nella looked away, jaw clenched. Hart did not push. He just tied his horse to the post, walked over to the porch, and sat down slow, like he had all the time in the world. "I can go," he offered, "but I will not." "Not unless you tell me to." She looked at him, at the way he sat calm, hands resting on his knees, not staring, not judging, just waiting. "You want work?" she asked finally. "If you will have me. You know anything about fencing?" "A fair bit." "Better with horses." She hesitated, then nodded once. "You can stay. Barn's clean." And that was how the cowboy came. Days moved quiet after that. Hart worked from first light, fixing fences, mending the barn roof, hauling water without being asked. He never stepped inside the house unless invited, and never looked at the scar on her wrist, though she caught him glancing at her face when he thought she would not notice. One evening, as they watched the sun dip low behind the cottonwoods, she asked, "Why did you really come?" He thought a long time before answering. "Because I heard what was done to you. And I figured someone ought to show you that not all men are like that." "You could have written," she said softly. "I could have. But letters do not fix fences or feed chickens." She smiled then, a small thing but real. The nights were cold, and sometimes she would find him asleep outside the barn, wrapped in his coat, refusing to take the house bed even though it sat empty. "You are stubborn," she told him one morning, handing him coffee. He grinned, teeth white against his sun-darkened skin. "Only when it is worth it." By late April, the grass came back green and the lambs were born. They worked side by side, quiet most days, talking only when needed. But something grew between them, not fast or loud, but steady. The kind of thing that lives in shared glances and small kindnesses, an extra cup of water left out, a coat placed over her shoulders when she did not ask. One evening, as thunder rolled far off, she sat beside him on the porch. "You think I am ruined?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "I have a brand right here." She lifted her wrist. "I see it," he said, "but I do not care." Her eyes searched his face. "Everyone else does. I am not everyone." She looked away, shame and hurt flickering across her face. "Nella," he said gently, his voice low. "You were just a girl. He made a choice that should have never been his to make, but it does not change what kind of woman you are now. Branded or not, I would wait a lifetime for a girl like you." She turned to him, startled. "Why?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because you are strong. Because you stayed kind. Because you kept going. And because since I got here, not once have I wanted to be anywhere else." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I have not known anything like that." "Not ever." "You do now," he said. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and she reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his. He took her hand, not pressing, not pulling, just holding. "I do not want to be afraid anymore," she whispered. "You do not have to be," he said. "Not with me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he sat still as stone, letting her rest. Later that night, as the rain came soft and steady on the roof, she opened the door to the house and said, "You should not sleep out there anymore." His eyes met hers. "You sure?" She nodded. "I want you here." And so he came inside, not as a visitor, not as a helper, but as someone who was finally, slowly becoming home. The scar on her wrist never faded. But over time, it stopped feeling like a brand. It felt like the start of something else, something worth waiting a lifetime for. By mid-May, the snowmelt had sunk deep into the soil, and the hills wore a green so soft it almost looked like velvet. The sheep grazed farther out now, and the creeks ran full with meltwater, tugging at their banks like they couldn't wait to be gone. Hart had taken to rising before the sun, a quiet rhythm he never disturbed with noise. Nella would sometimes catch sight of him from the kitchen window, his silhouette moving slow but sure through the silver light, loading tools into the wagon or checking hooves with his head bent low, like he spoke to the animals under his breath. One morning, as she was kneading biscuit dough, she noticed he lingered at the fence longer than usual, looking past the cottonwoods. She stepped outside, wiping her hands against her skirt. "What is it?" Hart didn't answer right away. "Looks like someone's coming," he said, nodding toward the rise. "Wagon, single horse, not heavy loaded." They waited in silence, the only sound the wind brushing through the grass. As the wagon creaked closer, Nella's brow tightened. "That's Clara Sutton," she said. "Widow from 2 homesteads over." Clara pulled up the reins and waved, her mouth tight. "I hate to trouble you," she called, "but I heard you've got a strong back and a good axle." Hart stepped forward. "What do you need?" Tree came down across my well shed. "I can't lift it alone," Nella answered before he could. "He'll go with you." Clara looked between them, eyes sharp. "Much obliged." As Hart climbed into the wagon bed, Nella handed him a wrapped biscuit without speaking. Their fingers brushed, and his eyes lingered on her for a breath longer than the moment needed. He didn't return until late afternoon, sunburnt and streaked with sweat. She met him at the well with a tin cup of cool water, and he drank deep before leaning against the post. "She's got no business out there alone," he said. Nella looked toward the horizon. "She won't leave. Her husband's buried on that land." "She didn't ask me about you," he said. "But she watched you every time your name came up. She's waiting to see if I embarrass myself." "You haven't." She stared into her cup. "Not yet." Later, Hart took the young ram back down to the southern pasture. When he returned, he carried a stack of shed antlers in his arms, dropped by elk before winter retreated. "What are those for?" she asked, brushing a curl from her cheek. He set them on the porch. "I thought maybe you'd want to try carving, or sell them for buttons and tool handles. If not, they're good for mending fence joints." She crouched beside the pile, running her hand along the pale ridges. "You think up things like this often?" He crouched beside her. "Only when it seems like someone might need something useful to do with her hands." Nella didn't answer, but that night she brought out her father's old penknife and worked one of the tines down to a smooth point. She didn't show heart. Not yet. The next day a letter arrived. The writer was a boy from town, no more than 12, and he handed it to Hart without getting down from the mule. From Kansas, the boy said. Came through Cheyenne. Hart read it alone, leaning against the barn. When Nella came out to bring him a fresh shirt, he folded the paper and slipped it into his saddlebag. Bad news? She asked. No, just a friend I used to ride with. He's got work out east if I want it. She didn't move for a long moment. Are you going? Hart didn't meet her eyes. Not unless I'm told to. She pulled the shirt from the basket and handed it to him. It's not my place to tell you anything. He took the shirt but didn't move to change. You think I've been waiting here for work? I don't know what men like you wait for. He stepped forward, voice lower now. I came because I was tired of riding past things I couldn't change. Because I figured if I stayed long enough, maybe you'd believe someone meant to stay. She looked down at her hands. I don't know how to believe that. I know. He paused. But I'm still here. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. Not thunder, just cold wind and thick clouds. They brought the animals in early and lit the lanterns before dusk. Nella stood at the window watching the sky close over the hills. Hart brought the last of the tools in, his shoulders dusted with grit. When he stepped inside, she was setting a second plate on the table. You eat yet? She asked. He shook his head. Didn't want to. They sat across from each other, the lamp between them. For a long time they didn't speak. Then Nella reached into her pocket and placed a small carved button beside his plate. Bastard elk horn, shaped like a flower with 5 uneven petals. I didn't have thread, she said. Hart turned it over in his hand. Would you wear it? She asked. He met her eyes. I'd carry it on my chest. She exhaled, slow and careful, like letting go of something heavy. I didn't think I'd want someone, she said. Not ever. Hart reached across the table, his hand resting palm up between them. But I want you. She set her hand in his. No hesitation. Outside, the wind howled over the prairie. But inside the house, it was quiet, and in that quiet something settled between them. Not loud. Not sudden, but sure. By the end of May, the earth had turned warm beneath their boots, and the first wild roses bloomed low along the creek. Nella had taken to walking the fence-a-line in the evenings, a habit born from both need and restlessness. Hart often joined her, not for the fencing he checked it earlier in the day, but for the quiet that came with her company. One such evening, she paused by the south gate, watching a pair of kestrels circle overhead. Hart leaned on the post beside her, arms folded. You always walk this stretch, he said. Why here? She traced the grain of the wood with her thumb. This was the first section I fixed myself. After the thaw, he studied the line of posts running east. Looked solid. It didn't start that way. She turned and walked on. He followed, bootsteps slow behind hers. A few paces later, she said, Did you ever know your mother? Some. She died when I was 10. Consumption. Mine went the year I turned 7, she said. Fever took her fast. I remember her bread. She used to press a thumbprint in the center of every roll like it was a mark to keep us full. Hart kept his gaze forward. Sounds like she loved you. She did. He didn't. They walked without speaking for a stretch. The wind carried the scent of sage and damp earth. At the western edge where the grass thickened, Nella stopped again, this time kneeling. Hart stopped beside her, watching as she pulled something from the dirt, narrow, rusted, and bent. She held it up. Nail from the old corral, been there long, since before I could lift a hammer. He took it from her hand. You keep everything. Only what proves it was real. The next morning, she found him at the work table outside the barn, smoothing a scrap of pine. He'd split it into a square no wider than a man's palm. In the center, he'd nailed the bent iron through, flattened flush. Thought you might want it kept better than a pocket, he said. She didn't answer, but she brought it inside and set it on the mantel. That afternoon, they took the wagon into town, her first trip since autumn. The road was rutted from runoff, but the trees arched green above them, and the air smelled of thawed stone. She wore her hair tied back in a kerchief, and her hands didn't tremble when they passed the first house at the edge of town. Folks on porches looked up, some nodding, others not, but no one spoke. At the general store, Nella stayed close to the shelves, eyes lowered. Hart moved through the narrow aisles with quiet efficiency, gathering salt, lamp oil, and flour. When they reached the counter, the shopkeeper, Mr. Edlin, gave her a long look. "Didn't expect to see you," he said. "I needed supplies," she replied. He nodded once, then rang up the total. "Your pa's account's been settled. It should be." Hart placed the coins in the man's palm without a word. Back outside, Nella paused on the boardwalk. "I thought it'd feel worse," she said. "Why doesn't it?" "Because I didn't flinch." Hart loaded the wagon slowly. "You don't need to prove anything to them." "I wasn't trying to," he glanced at her. "Then what were you doing?" "Proving it to myself." The ride home was quiet, but not heavy. The kind of silence that settled easy between two people who understood something had changed. After they'd offloaded the sacks and stored the oil, Hart lingered by the porch rail, watching the sun sink low. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "I used to," she said, "when I was younger." And now she looked out over the pasture where the sheep moved slow beneath the cottonwoods. "Now I think about staying if the right person stayed with me." Hart's voice was steady. "I'd stay if I'm still wanted." She didn't look at him, but her voice came firm. "You are." That night she lit the lamp and set 2 plates without thinking. When he stepped inside, drying his hands on a rag, she nodded toward the table. "I made enough." He sat and they ate without fuss. Afterward she stood by the hearth, hands folded. "I've never asked you what you want." "I want peace," he said. "And something that feels like it might last." She turned to face him. "You think I can give that?" "I think you already have." He crossed to her slow, giving her time. When he reached her, his hand brushed hers, not taking, just touching. She looked up at him. "I don't know how to ask for things." "You don't have to. I want you to stay in the house." "I figured you did." "But not as a guest." He nodded, eyes steady. "Then I won't be." She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. His arms came around her, warm and sure. For the first time, she let herself believe in the shape of a life that didn't run from the past, but stood still long enough to build something better. Outside, the moon had risen full, casting the valley in soft silver. Inside, 2 people stood close, no longer waiting for the world to change. They'd begun changing it themselves. The first morning of June brought a heat that clung to the skin before the sun had cleared the ridge. Nella stood at the edge of the orchard. Eyes narrowed at the peach trees her mother had planted before the sickness took her. Most years the blossoms came and withered without fruit, but this spring the branches hung heavy with promise. "They'll need thinning," Hart said, stepping beside her with the pruning shears in hand. "Too many on one limb and they'll rot where they hang." She reached up and touched a cluster. "I didn't think they'd come in at all." He looked past the trees toward the barn. "Things surprise you when they're left to root long enough." They worked until midday, the sun beating down hard, sweat darkening the back of Hart's shirt and soaking the edges of Nella's collar. She didn't complain, but she paused more often than usual, hand pressed to her lower ribs. "You hurting?" Hart asked, not unkind. "Just pulled something last week when I lifted that feed sack wrong." He set the shears down. "That's not a pain to ignore." "Let me see." She hesitated, then unbuttoned the top edge of her blouse and pulled the fabric aside just enough to reveal the bruising faint, yellowing at the edges. Hart didn't touch it, just looked, jaw working slightly. "I'll do the lifting a while," he said. "I'm not broken." "No." "But I'm here." In the afternoon, she sat at the table carving a new set of buttons from the scrap antlers he'd brought in last week. Hart came in from the shed, wiping his hands on an old flour sack. "There's a letter for you," he said, dropping an envelope on the table. "Ryder came while I was fixing the yoke." Nella picked it up, her name written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. "It's from my mother's cousin," she said after reading the return. "She lives near Laramie. I haven't heard from her since I was a child." Hart leaned against the wall. "She say why now? She heard about my father. Someone in town must have written." She opened the letter slow, scanning each line with a look Hart couldn't read. "She says I should come stay with her. Says I'd be better off where people don't whisper when I pass." Hart's voice stayed even. "Is that what you want?" Nella folded the letter sharply. "No." She stood and crossed to the stove, stoking the fire. He didn't move from where he stood. "I just thought I should tell you," she said finally. "You don't owe me that. I didn't say I did." They left it there. That night, the wind died down, and the land held its breath. Nella lay awake listening to the creak of the rafters, the slow shift of the house as it cooled from the day's heat. Hart's cot was just down the hall now. Not the guest bed, he'd moved it into the small room beside hers after the roof began leaking in the back corner. She got up and crossed the floor barefoot, tapping twice against the frame of his door. He opened it without speaking, eyes soft in the lantern light. "I can't sleep," she said. He stepped aside. "Come in." She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the quilt her mother once pieced from flour sacks and worn skirts. "When you first came here," she said, "did you plan to leave after a season?" Hart sat beside her, close but not touching. "I didn't have a plan. I just knew I wanted to be somewhere I could do some good." She looked at him. "Have you done it?" "I hope so." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I think you have." They sat like that for a while, silent. Then Hart said, "I've thought about what it might be like, staying, not as a hand, not just in the spare room." She didn't let go of his hand. "I've thought about it too." He turned to her, voice low. "If we did, it wouldn't be because I pity you. It'd be because I want to build something here. With you, I know." And it'd mean letting go of that mark he left. Not forgetting, but not letting it speak for you anymore. She nodded once. "I'm ready." The next morning they rode into town again, not for supplies, but to speak with Reverend Clay, who kept a ledger and a steady hand. They filled out the papers, nothing fancy. No lace, no guests. Just ink and names written side by side, and the understanding that they would walk forward from that point together. On the way home, Nella held the reins while Hart leaned back, hat tipped against the sun. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked. She glanced sideways. "Not before you rode up that first day, and now I can't imagine it any other way." The wagon rolled on, wheels steady, the road familiar and wide before them. Behind, the summer settled over the land like a promise kept. Ahead, the cottonwoods waited, green and full, their branches strong enough to hold the weight of new beginnings. The sun crested high by mid-June, and the heat settled in the hollows like it meant to stay. The creek ran slower now, its edges thick with algae and frogs that sang through the dusk. Inside the house, the walls held warmth well past nightfall, and Nella began leaving the windows propped with sticks to let the breeze move through. Hart had taken to sleeping in the front room, not from distance, but because the back chamber, where he'd moved his cot, needed repair. The roofline leaned just enough to make the rafters whisper in wind, and he didn't trust it through the storm season. They agreed it would be safer this way, and when Nella came down in the mornings, she always found the blanket folded neat at the foot of the settee, the fire already stirred from coals. One morning, she found him outside patching the chicken run, sleeves cuffed and straw hat pulled low. He didn't look up when she stepped beside him. "I want to build a smokehouse," she said. He paused, hammer still in hand. You've got something in mind. There's that old stone foundation behind the barn. It's not level, but it's dry. My mother used to say we'd build there someday. Hart straightened. You want to cure your own meat. I want to have enough next winter that we don't barter for it. He studied her a moment, then nodded. We'll need hickory if we can find it. And tight clay to seal the pit. I know where the clay is. The creek bends east past the second rise. I saw it when I was digging out the irrigation trench. She didn't wait for him to answer, just turned and started walking. He followed without a word. They reached the bend by late morning, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She knelt first, pressing her fingers into the bank and lifting a handful of the cool, rust-colored soil. Hart crouched beside her. That'll hold smoke. She looked over at him, chin tilted. Think we can finish it before July, if you're willing to dig. I've done worse. They hauled 2 sacks back between them, hands coated in fine grit, the smell of damp clay clinging to their clothes. That night, she soaked the cuts of lamb they'd saved in salt water, while Hart sharpened the carving knife against a whetstone by lamplight. They didn't need to speak, their movements fell into rhythm without effort. 3 days later, they laid the first stones. Nella worked beside him from sunup, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve, her forearms streaked with ash and soot. By the end of the week, the walls stood waist-high, and the fire pit was dug and ringed in slate. When they set the final beam across the top, she rested her hand against the frame. I used to think this land would always feel like his. Hart leaned beside her, gaze forward. Does it still? No, she said. Now it feels like mine. On the 4th of July, they rode into town again. Not for celebration, though paper flags fluttered from posts and children ran with ribbons tied to their wrists, but to see the lawyer who'd handled land deeds for years. Nella wanted the homestead papers amended. In the small, stuffy office above the smithy, she signed her name alongside Hart's. Not as transfer, not as sale, just as 2 names joined in claim. Outside, she squinted against the sunlight. It's strange. What is? Seeing my name next to someone else's and not feeling afraid of what it means. Hart touched her wrist, just above the place where the old scar lay hidden beneath linen. You're not that girl anymore. I know. They stayed in town past dusk, watching from the hill above the schoolhouse as fireworks cracked over the river. Nella leaned into his side, her chin tucked against his shoulder. I never thought I'd see a good life, she said. Hart didn't answer right away, just pulled her closer. You deserve one, he said, and you? I found mine when I found you. Back at the homestead, the garden had begun to yield onions first, then cabbage. The smokehouse held its scent now, and most nights, a thin ribbon of gray curled above it as they cured cuts for the winter ahead. Nella spent mornings with her hands in the soil, planting late squash and tying up the beans. Hart repaired the last of the eaves, then built a bench beneath the porch overhang where they ate supper when the air cooled. On the evening of the first rain in August, they sat there together, sharing a plate of cornbread and boiled greens. The sky rolled with low thunder and the smell of ozone lifted from the grass. Nella watched the horizon. Do you miss the trail? Hart took a slow bite, chewed, swallowed. Not since the day I saw you standing in that doorway with dust on your apron and a look like you'd never flinch again. She smiled, but didn't speak. Later that night, she lit a single candle in the window, as was her habit. Not for prayer, just to mark the place where warmth lived. Hart came in behind her, brushing rain from his coat. You going to bed? She asked. With you, if I'm welcome. You're always welcome. He stepped forward, kissed her forehead, then her cheek, and she turned into him with a breath that caught somewhere deep in her chest. They climbed the stairs slow, hand in hand. Seasons passed. The trees turned gold, then bare. then green again. The smokehouse filled and emptied, the orchard bore fruit, and the land held steady beneath their feet. They built a second room off the side of the house, then a third when the time came. Nella kept carving buttons, though she sold fewer now. Hart taught a neighbor's boy how to shoe a mule and took no pay for it. They went to town when they needed to, but never stayed long. The ranch grew with them, not in size, but in soul. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved soft through the cottonwoods, they could be found on the porch, fingers laced, eyes on the line of hills that marked the edge of everything they'd left behind. Home wasn't something they found. It was something they built together.